Eleanor Whitmore stepped off that wagon before it even stopped moving. Not because she was eager, because she had counted 17 seconds of silence from the men lining the fence, and she already knew what their faces meant. She had seen that look her entire life. She let them stare. Then she walked past every single one of them, pushed open the door of the collapsing smokehouse behind the barn, pressed her hand against the crumbling brick wall, and said the 5 words that would change everything about Black Creek Ranch forever. I can save this place. If this story already has your heart beating faster, you are exactly where you belong. Subscribe to this channel right now and hit that notification bell so you never miss a single chapter. Drop the name of your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels, and stay with me until the very end. Because what Eleanor Whitmore does next is something nobody on that ranch or anywhere in Wyoming Territory ever saw coming. Wyoming Territory, 1881. The wagon had been rolling since before dawn, cutting through frozen mud and dead grass, and Eleanor Whitmore had not slept a single hour of the 12-hour ride. She had not slept because she had been calculating. She had the letter from the advertisement folded in her coat pocket, worn soft at the creases from how many times she had unfolded and refolded it during the 3 days of train travel from St. Louis. She had memorized every word. She knew the rancher's name. She knew the number of workers he was responsible for feeding. She knew the ranch had a smokehouse because she had asked the agency directly, and the woman at the desk had checked the records and confirmed it. That was the only detail that mattered. Not the rancher's age, not his temperament, not what he looked like or what he expected from a wife. The smokehouse was the detail that made Eleanor pack her trunk and buy the ticket and get on the train without telling a single person in St. Louis where she was going. Because Eleanor Whitmore knew exactly what a working smokehouse could do for a struggling operation. And she knew something else too. Something she had learned from 22 years of being the daughter. Nobody bragged about the woman, nobody chose the person. Every room seemed to exhale a quiet disappointment over whenever she walked through the door. She knew that the things people ignored were usually the things that held everything together. She had been ignored her entire life, so she understood exactly how much power lived inside something everyone else had written off. The wagon stopped. The driver, a weathered man named Holt, who had not spoken more than 4 words, the entire ride, set the brake and climbed down without offering her his hand. Eleanor did not wait for it. She gripped the side rail, stepped down onto the frozen ground, and straightened her coat. She was 30 years old, broad-shouldered, heavy, carrying the kind of weight that made men look away and women whisper behind their gloves. Her face was plain by the standards of the fashion plates in the St. Louis papers. Her hair was dark and wound tight at the back of her neck because loose hair had no place in a working kitchen. She had learned a long time ago not to apologize for how she looked. She had also learned more recently to stop waiting for that habit to feel easy. 22 men were lined up along the fence. She counted them before she looked at any of their faces because the number mattered more than their expressions. 22. That matched the letter. That was real then. This wasn't some exaggerated advertisement meant to lure a desperate woman into a situation with no exit. There were genuinely 22 people depending on whoever ran that kitchen. She let herself look at their faces then, and what she saw did not surprise her. Some of them were simply curious, the blank open curiosity of men who spent most of their days with horses and didn't interact with new people often enough to develop social masks. A few were politely neutral. 1 or 2 were actively trying to look anywhere but at her. And then there were the ones who weren't hiding anything at all. A tall man near the end of the fence line, broad through the chest, with a jaw that looked like it had been cut from the same red rock as the Wyoming bluffs, crossed his arms over his front and tilted his head back and let his eyes move over her, the way a man appraises a piece of livestock he's already decided he doesn't want. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. Eleanor had been read that way before. She could translate it without effort. She looked away from him. She looked instead at the property. The fences along the far pasture were broken in 3 places she could see from where she was standing. The barn door was hanging at an angle that meant the upper hinge had come loose, and nobody had gotten to fixing it yet. The main house needed new shingles on the south side. The yard was not dirty exactly, but it had the specific kind of bareness that came from too many people working too hard for too long with too little, where anything that wasn't strictly necessary had simply stopped being maintained. She recognized that particular exhaustion. She had grown up watching it. And then she saw the smokehouse. It sat behind the barn, set back from the main buildings, and her first clear sight of it landed somewhere low in her chest, like a stone dropping into still water. The roof had partially collapsed on the western side. The door was warped out of its frame and standing open at an angle, and she could see from where she stood that the interior was dark and damp-looking, and had probably been used for storage at some point before it was abandoned entirely. The brick chimney was intact, which was the first real piece of good news she had encountered since the wagon turned off the main road. She was still looking at it when she heard boots on the frozen ground behind her. "Miss Whitmore." She turned. Nathaniel Carter was not what she had expected, and she had worked very carefully to expect nothing. He was somewhere in his mid-30s, lean in the way of men who worked outside and forgot to eat, with dark hair going gray at the temples and eyes that were doing something complicated, trying to be welcoming and failing in a way that had nothing to do with cruelty and everything to do with exhaustion. He had the look of a man who had been managing a crisis for so long that crisis had simply become the texture of every ordinary day. He held out his hand. She shook it. "Nathaniel Carter," he said. "I'm glad you made it safely." "Eleanor Whitmore," she said. "I'm glad there's still something left to arrive to." He blinked. She had not meant it as a criticism. She had meant it as an honest observation, and a small reassurance she was not the kind of woman who showed up expecting everything to be perfect and then fell apart when it wasn't. But she watched him process her words and decide something about her, and she didn't know yet what he had decided. He cleared his throat. "I should tell you up front," he said, "that the situation here it's more difficult than the advertisement may have suggested." I assumed it was. The winter supply routes were destroyed in November. We lost most of our stored provisions. The men have been on reduced portions for 6 weeks. I have been trying to find solutions, but— "Mr. Carter?" He stopped. "Show me the kitchen first," she said. "Then show me the smokehouse." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "All right." The kitchen was worse than she expected. That was rare. Eleanor had a well-calibrated sense of how bad things could get, and she did not usually find herself surprised in a downward direction. But she stood in the doorway of that ranch kitchen and took a slow inventory of the shelves and the cold box and the hanging space and the work surfaces, and what she found was a room that had been stretched past its capacity for so long that it had stopped being a kitchen and become a symbol of everything that was failing. The shelves held salt, a diminishing supply of dried beans, 3 tins of something she couldn't identify, and a sack of cornmeal with maybe 12 pounds left in it. The cold box held 2 partial sides of beef that had been cut down to almost nothing. There were no herbs, no preserved vegetables, no cured anything, no smoked anything, no jarred anything. "You've been making soup," she said. "When there's enough to make it," Nathaniel said from behind her. "Sometimes it's cornbread and whatever the men can find." Last Thursday it was cornbread and coffee, and the men didn't complain, but— "They wouldn't," she said. "They know complaining doesn't make food appear." "No," he said quietly. "It doesn't." She turned to face him. "How many head of cattle do you have remaining?" 37. "I can't slaughter more without damaging the breeding stock for spring." "I understand that. What about hogs?" 6. "I've been reluctant to touch them for the same reason." "I'm not going to ask you to touch them yet," she said. "What about deer? What's the hunting situation in the territory around here?" He looked at her differently then. Not the complicated, exhausted look from before. Something more alert. "There's deer. The men have been hunting when they have time, but with the workload, time's been short. If I can coordinate the hunting with the preservation, the workload of the smokehouse will actually reduce the pressure on your breeding stock." She paused. "But I need to see the smokehouse before I make any commitments." Right, he said. Yes, of course. He led her out through the back of the kitchen and across the yard and around the barn, and the whole way she was aware of the silence that was following them. The specific silence of 22 men, pretending they weren't watching. The smokehouse was worse up close. The roof had not just partially collapsed, it had caved in on the western corner completely, and someone had thrown a piece of canvas over the gap at some point, and the canvas had rotted through and was now more of a suggestion of coverage than actual coverage. The floor was earthen and had a damp smell that told her water had been getting in for a long time. The brick furnace in the center was substantial, which was good, but the firebox door was rusted open at an angle, and the racks that should have hung from the ceiling supports had been removed at some point or had fallen. The chimney was still sound. She stood inside the space and turned slowly, taking everything in, not as it was, but as it could be. Nathaniel watched her from the doorway. "I apologize," he said. I should have been clearer in the advertisement about the state of things here. I understand if this isn't—" "Stop apologizing," she said without looking at him. He went quiet. She kept turning, kept calculating. The structure was basically sound. The walls were solid. The foundation was good. The chimney was intact. The roof damage was significant but manageable. The floor would need to be addressed for moisture. The furnace could be restored. The racks could be rebuilt. The firebox door was a straightforward repair. She had rebuilt worse. She had started from nothing before and built something. She knew what this required. She turned around and looked at Nathaniel Carter standing in the doorway of a smokehouse he had clearly already given up on, and she said, "I can have this operational in 2 weeks." He stared at her. "Miss Whitmore, 3 weeks at the most if the timber for the roof repairs takes time to source. But the furnace can be lit within the week if I have 2 men to help me clear and repair the firebox. The racks I can build myself if I have access to the lumber. You—" He stopped, started again. "You know how to repair a smokehouse. My father ran one in Missouri for 23 years, she said. I grew up working it. I know curing, I know smoking, I know preservation. I know what this building needs to become, and I know how long it will take." She looked at him levelly. "I also know how to cook for 22 men, Mr. Carter, if that's still a concern. But what I'm telling you is that the smokehouse is the answer to your supply problem not just this winter, but going forward. If we do this right, you won't face another winter like this one." Nathaniel Carter was quiet for a long moment. She watched something move through his face, something that looked like the first stirring of a thing he had stopped letting himself feel, because feeling it, and then having it taken away again, was worse than not feeling it at all. She recognized that too. She had spent years feeling exactly that way about herself. "All right," he finally said. "All right. All right, Miss Whitmore." He stepped back from the doorway and gestured toward the main house. "Let me show you where you'll be staying, and then I'd like to hear your plan." She nodded and walked past him, and as she came around the corner of the barn, she found herself walking directly toward the fence line, where the men were still standing, and the tall man with the crossed arms was still there, still watching, still wearing that particular expression. He looked her up and down one more time as she approached. Then he said loud enough for the men around him to hear, "Well, suppose she can always eat what she cooks." A few of the men laughed. Eleanor stopped walking. She had a choice in that moment, and she made it very deliberately. She looked at the man. "What's your name?" she said. He seemed surprised she'd asked. "Cole Dawson." "Mr. Dawson," she said. "I've been underestimated by better men than you in finer places than this, and I'm still standing. You'll either help me fix that smokehouse or you won't. But either way, in 3 weeks, you'll be eating the best food you've had since your mother's kitchen." She paused. If she was any good. The men who had laughed were very quiet now. Cole Dawson's jaw tightened. Eleanor walked past him toward the main house. Behind her, she heard Nathaniel Carter say something to Cole Dawson in a low voice that she couldn't make out. She didn't need to. Whatever was said, it was between them. She had work to think about. The room she was given was small and plainly furnished and cold. She unpacked her trunk with the efficiency of someone who had learned not to attach sentiment to the act of settling into a new space. Because new spaces had a way of becoming old spaces, you had to leave, and it was better not to build any expectations into the unpacking. She laid out her tools on the bed beside her clothing. Her curing knives. Her father's record book, which she had memorized but kept anyway, because the handwriting felt like a hand on her shoulder. Her own notebook, which was dense with formulas and timelines, and the specific knowledge of what different cuts of meat needed, and how long, and at what temperature, and with what combination of salt and smoke and thyme. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the record book. Her father had started with nothing. A rented building borrowed tools, 2 hogs, and a recipe he'd carried in his head from Tennessee. By the time Eleanor was 10 years old, Whitmore's Smokehouse was supplying 4 towns. By the time she was 20, it was the most well-regarded operation in the county. He had taught her everything, not because he expected her to take it over. She had brothers for that, and the times were what they were, and a daughter running a smokehouse was not something that fit neatly into what was expected. But he had taught her because she was there, and she was willing, and she had a gift for it, the particular patience and precision that preservation required. And he was a man who believed in not wasting what was in front of you. She put the record book down. She thought about what she had found in that kitchen. She thought about the furnace in the smokehouse intact beneath the rust and the ruin. She thought about 37 head of cattle and 6 hogs, and a territory full of deer that nobody had time to hunt systematically. She thought about 22 men who had been eating watered-down soup and cornbread for 6 weeks and hadn't complained once. She thought about the look on Nathaniel Carter's face when she said she could have the smokehouse operational in 2 weeks. That look was what had made her say it with as much certainty as she'd used, even though certainty in her experience was something you performed into existence through preparation and work, not something that arrived fully formed. She had work to do. She got up off the bed and went to find the rancher. She found him in the main room of the house, standing over a table covered in papers, ledgers she saw as she got closer. Numbers he was not happy about from the look of his face. He looked up when she came in. "I need to know your budget for materials," she said without preamble. "Timber for the roof, new rack hardware. I can work around most of what's already there, but there are items I'll need." He set down the paper he was holding. "Miss Whitmore, I want to be honest with you about something. Please. The bank is... There's a man named Victor Hale who has been buying up land in this territory for the past 3 years. He has a particular interest in this property. I've been under pressure from the bank that holds my note, and I believe Hale has a relationship with that bank that is not coincidental." He paused. "I am telling you this because I want you to understand the situation you have arrived into. The ranch is not simply struggling. There are people who want it to fail." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. "Does Victor Hale know about the smokehouse?" Nathaniel blinked. What? Does he know it's there? Does he know what it could be?" "I know. I don't believe it's even occurred to him. He's interested in the land and the water rights, not the..." "Good," she said. "Then we have more time than you realize." She pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. "Now tell me your budget for materials." He sat down slowly across from her. He named a number. It was tight. It was workable. She opened her notebook. "All right," she said. "Here's what we're going to do." They talked for 2 hours. By the end of it, the papers on the table had been pushed aside, and Eleanor's notebook was open between them, and Nathaniel Carter was leaning forward over it with the specific posture of a man who had stopped bracing for disaster and started considering the possibility that something might actually go right. She noticed when the shift happened. It happened when she explained the economics of a working smokehouse, not just in terms of feeding the ranch crew, but in terms of what it could mean to sell preserved meat to the mining camps and the growing towns and the railroad crews that were working their way across the territory. She had numbers for it. She had estimates. She had a timeline. She had done this before in her head 100 times in the years since her father's operation had passed to her brothers, and she had been left with the knowledge and nowhere to apply it. He listened to all of it. He asked good questions. And somewhere in the second hour, looking at the map she had sketched in her notebook of the smokehouse layout and the modifications she was planning. He said quietly, "You've thought about this for a long time." "Yes," she said. "Why didn't you—" He stopped himself. She waited. "Forgive me," he said. "That's not my business." "It's all right," she said. "You were going to ask why I didn't do this somewhere else. Why I came here instead." Something like that. She looked down at the notebook. "I had a life that didn't leave room for it," she said. "I was engaged once. The man I was engaged to decided about 6 months before the wedding that he had changed his mind. He told me—" She stopped, let a beat pass. "He told me that he cared for me, but that he worried what people would think. About how I looked. About whether I was the kind of wife he wanted to be seen with." Nathaniel was very still across the table. "After that," she said, "I spent a few years making myself small, trying to fit into what people expected. It didn't work. It doesn't work. You can't make yourself into a different shape to satisfy people who've already decided what you're worth." She looked up. "So when this advertisement came across my desk at the agency, and the woman told me the ranch had a smokehouse, I thought, here is someone who needs what I actually have to offer. Not what I could pretend to be, what I am." Nathaniel Carter looked at her for a long moment. He said, "I'm glad you came." It was a simple thing to say, but Eleanor Whitmore, who had spent the last several years becoming an expert at knowing when words were hollow and when they held actual weight, recognized that he meant it. She nodded. She closed her notebook. "I'll start on the smokehouse tomorrow morning," she said. "I'll need 2 men to help with the heavy work. I'd appreciate if one of them wasn't Cole Dawson, but I'll leave that to your judgment." A ghost of something moved across Nathaniel's face, not quite a smile. "I'll see what I can arrange," he said. She stood up. "One more thing," she said. "Yes, when I have the first product ready, the first real batch of cured meat, I want every man on this ranch at that table. I want it to be something they remember." He looked at her. "Why?" She thought about how to say it. "Because they've been surviving for 6 weeks," she said. "That's not the same as living. And I want them to remember the difference, because that memory is what's going to carry them through the rest of what this winter has left." Nathaniel Carter was quiet. Then very quietly he said, "Miss Whitmore." "Yes. I think the ranch hands are going to be very surprised by you." She picked up her notebook from the table. "Mr. Carter," she said, "I have been surprising people my entire life. I'm fairly used to the look." She walked back to her room. She sat on the edge of the bed again in the dark. Outside she could hear the wind pushing against the walls of the house, that particular Wyoming wind that wasn't loud so much as it was constant, pressing in from all directions, like a reminder that the world out here was big and indifferent, and did not make exceptions for what you needed it to be. She had come a very long way. She had left behind a city that had never quite fit her, and a life that had shrunk itself to accommodate other people's discomfort, and a version of herself she was done trying to maintain. She had come to a broken ranch in a cold territory with 22 hungry men and a ruined smokehouse and a rancher who was quietly drowning in debt and the particular despair of someone who had been trying very hard for a very long time to keep something alive. She thought about her father's record book. She thought about his hands covered in the evidence of everything he had built. She thought about what he used to say when something looked impossible. "Doesn't matter what it looks like from the outside, Ellie. What matters is what's still standing underneath." She looked at the wall of the small, cold room. "All right," she said to no one. "Let's see what's still standing." She reached over and blew out the lamp. In the dark, she listened to the wind. She had work to do in the morning, and Eleanor Whitmore had never once in her life let morning find her unprepared. She was up before the sun. Not because she had slept well, she hadn't, but because lying in the dark listening to the wind and running calculations in her head had reached the point of diminishing returns, and there was no version of this situation that got better by waiting. She dressed in the dark. She wound her hair back tight. She put on the heaviest coat she owned, which was not as heavy as she needed it to be for Wyoming in February, but it would have to do until she could do something about that. She went to the kitchen first. She had not cooked the night before. By the time her conversation with Nathaniel had ended, the men had already eaten whatever they were eating, and she had not wanted to disrupt the rhythm of a place she'd been in for less than a day. But standing now in the kitchen before dawn with a lamp in her hand, taking her second full inventory of the shelves, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of how dire it was. 12 pounds of cornmeal, maybe less. The beans were a solid supply, actually. Someone had laid in a good stock of dried beans, which told her that whoever had been managing the kitchen before understood something about necessity, if not about nutrition or variety. The 2 partial beef sides were going to be gone within 3 days if she fed 22 men anything approaching a real portion. There was lard. There was salt. Plenty of it, which was fortunate because salt was going to be the foundation of everything she planned to do. There was a small barrel of molasses that she hadn't noticed the night before tucked behind the cornmeal sack. She opened it and smelled it. Good, not spoiled, sweet and dark and thick. She stood in the kitchen in the lamplight, and she thought about molasses and salt and smoke and time, and something in her chest that had been wound very tight for a very long time started to loosen just slightly, because she could see it now. The path from what was here to what could be here. And it was not easy, and it was not fast, but it was real. She was building the fire in the stove when she heard the back door. She turned. A young man stood in the doorway, maybe 17 or 18, with a thin frame, and the particular look of someone who had grown several inches in the last year, and hadn't quite caught up to his own limbs yet. He was holding his hat in his hands, and staring at her with enormous eyes, like she was something that had appeared without warning, and he was still deciding whether to be alarmed. "You're up early?" she said. "Yes, ma'am." He didn't move from the doorway. "Are you coming in or staying out?" He came in, carefully, like he was stepping into something that might shift under his weight. "I'm Tommy," he said. "Tommy Briggs. I help with the animals mostly, but sometimes I help in the kitchen when things are busy." He paused. "I heard you were up. Saw the lamp." "How did you see the lamp?" "I sleep in the barn." She looked at him. "Why do you sleep in the barn?" He shrugged with one shoulder, the kind of shrug that meant there was a real answer, but he'd decided not to give it. "I like it out there." She decided not to push it. Not yet. "Can you cook?" she asked. "No, ma'am. Not much. I can boil things." "Good. Boiling is the beginning of everything." She turned back to the stove. "Come over here. I'll show you something." He crossed the kitchen and stood beside her, still holding his hat, and she showed him how she was building the fire, not just lighting it, but building it, laying it in a particular way that would give her steady heat, rather than a fast, hot burn that dropped off. "Why does that matter?" he asked. "For cooking, I mean." "Because even heat is the difference between something being right and something being close," she said. "Close isn't good enough when you're feeding 22 people." He watched her hands. "The other men said you're going to fix the smokehouse," he said. "That's right. They don't think you can." "I know." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I think you can." She looked at him. His expression was serious and a little defiant, like he'd said something he expected to get challenged on and was preparing his defense. "Why?" she asked. He thought about it. "Because you came here knowing what it looked like," he said. "Most people, when they find out something's worse than they expected, they get this look, like they want to go back. You don't have that look." Eleanor Whitmore studied the boy for a moment. "How old are you, Tommy?" 16, ma'am." "You're observant for 16. He almost smiled. "People don't pay much attention to me. I pay attention back." She understood that more than she was going to say. She turned back to the stove. "I'm going to need help with the smokehouse. 2 people starting this morning. You want to be one of them?" He went very still. Mr. Carter would have to say so. "I'll ask Mr. Carter." She glanced at him. "You want to be one of them?" "Yes, ma'am," he said, quietly, like he was afraid to say it too loud in case someone took it back. "All right. Put your hat on and go wash up and come back when the sun's up. You can eat something before we start." He nodded, put his hat on, and went back out the door. She listened to his footsteps cross the yard. Then she turned back to the fire and the kitchen and the work of feeding 22 men on almost nothing, and she thought that sometimes the smallest things were the ones that told you the most about a place. A 16-year-old boy who slept in a barn because of something he wouldn't say, who paid attention because nobody paid attention to him. She filed that away. Nathaniel came into the kitchen at 6. He stopped when he saw her at the stove, and she could tell by the quality of his stopping that he had not entirely expected her to be there, that some part of him had been bracing for the possibility that she'd weighed the full reality of what she'd walked into and gotten on the first available wagon back to town. "Coffee's ready," she said without turning around. He moved to the table and poured himself a cup. "You slept?" he asked. "Enough." She turned to face him. "I want Tommy Briggs on the Smokehouse crew this morning. Who else can you spare?" he thought. "Martinez is good with his hands, and he won't give you any trouble." "Not Cole Dawson?" "No," he agreed without hesitation or explanation. She nodded. "I'll need to go over the material list with you before I start. I found some things in the kitchen that change a few of the numbers. We have more salt than I thought, which is good. And there's a barrel of molasses that I want to use in the curing process. I'll need to know the fastest way to get timber delivered here. There's a mill 11 miles east. I can send a rider today." "Do that." She turned back to the stove. "Breakfast in 20 minutes. Nathaniel stood at the table with his coffee. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Yes. I want you to know that what you said last night, the plan you laid out, I've been trying to find my way to something like that for months, and I couldn't see it. I couldn't see the path." He paused. "Thank you." She didn't say it was nothing because it wasn't nothing, and she was done diminishing things that weren't nothing. "Let me feed your men," she said. "Then we'll see how they feel about me." Breakfast was cornbread and beans with salt pork, and the last of the dried apples stewed down with molasses and a little heat. It was not a fancy meal, but it was hot, and it was seasoned, and it was enough, actually enough portioned generously, instead of the rationed, careful portions the men had been getting, because Eleanor had done the math, and she knew they could cover today and tomorrow and still execute on her plan before the supplies ran critical. She watched the men eat. She stayed at the back of the room at the stove, monitoring and refilling and watching their faces. This was something her father had taught her, and that she had never forgotten. You could learn more about what people needed by watching them eat than by asking them directly. People were honest when they thought they were only talking to their food. The young ones ate fast and asked for seconds without looking up the specific hunger of growing bodies that had been undernourished for weeks. The older men ate more deliberately, but she could see the shift in their posture as the food hit the slight drop of shoulders that had been held tight, the way faces that had been set and careful started to go a little slack at the edges. Cole Dawson ate without looking at her. She had not expected him to look at her. That was fine. She didn't need him to look at her. She needed him to eat, and he was eating, and eventually, the food would speak for itself more clearly than anything she could say to him directly. After breakfast, she found Nathaniel at the door and told him the morning plan, and by the time she reached the smokehouse, Tommy Briggs was already there, and a compact, dark-haired man in his 30s was leaning against the outside wall with his arms folded and his head tilted in an assessing way. "Martinez," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "Have you worked on a building before carpentry repair?" "Some so," he said. "Enough. Good." She pushed open the smokehouse door and stepped inside and heard both of them follow her, and she started talking immediately because the fastest way to get something built was to give people a clear picture of what they were building toward. She walked them through every section of the space, what needed to come down, what could be saved, what needed to be rebuilt entirely, what the priority sequence was, and why. She talked about the furnace and the chimney and the rack placement and the airflow, and she did it in plain language without condescension, and she could feel the quality of their attention as she spoke. Martinez asked questions that told her he actually understood what she was explaining and was thinking 2 steps ahead of her words. Tommy asked questions that told her he'd never done any of this before, but was determined to understand it completely before he touched anything. She answered every question fully. "All right," she said at the end of it. "Let's start with the roof. We're going to work from the inside out, sure, up what we can today, so that if it rains or snows tonight, we're not losing ground." "What do we use for the roof until the timber comes?" Martinez asked. "The canvas over the gap is mostly gone, but there's enough left along the edges to give us something to work with. And there's timber in the barn. Nathaniel confirmed it last night. Not enough for the full repair, but enough for a temporary brace." She looked at both of them. "Ready?" "Yes, ma'am," Tommy said. Martinez just moved. She respected that. They worked. It was hard work. Cold air, awkward angles. The particular challenge of trying to repair something that had been neglected long enough that each thing you tried to fix revealed something else that also needed fixing underneath it. She had expected that. She had built the expectation of extra complications into her timeline. What she had not fully calculated was how fast Martinez worked, or how quickly Tommy learned. By mid-morning, they had the interior of the smokehouse clear of debris, the worst of the collapsed roof material removed, and a temporary brace in place that would hold against weather for at least a week. The furnace firebox door had been the subject of 30 minutes of focused effort from Martinez, who attacked the rusted hinge with a combination of patience and a short iron bar, and a vocabulary of Spanish that he kept at a low volume, but clearly felt strongly about, and who emerged from the effort with the door moving freely on its hinge and a look of profound personal satisfaction. She told him it was excellent work. He nodded once in the way of a man who was used to doing excellent work without anyone mentioning it. They were eating the lunch she'd brought out in a covered pot. More beans this time, with chunks of salt pork, and a thick broth that was far better than it had any right to be given what she'd had to work with when Cole Dawson appeared in the doorway of the smokehouse. He stood there for a moment, looking at the cleared space, and the braced roof, and the open furnace door, with an expression she couldn't entirely read. Then he looked at her. "Need another hand," he said. It was not a question, and it was not an offer. It was the specific statement of a man who had come to say something and had stripped it down to its minimum. She looked at him. "Can you build a rack?" she said. "I can build anything." "Show me." She gave him the dimensions. She needed the specific angles and spacing of the rack that would hang from the ceiling supports, and she showed him where the lumber was, and he looked at her measurements written in her notebook, and then he went to work. She went back to her own work. An hour later, she walked over to where he was and looked at what he was building. It was exactly right. Not close. Exactly right. She didn't say so immediately. She checked every joint and every angle and every dimension deliberately because she needed to know for certain, and also because she was not going to praise something simply to make someone feel good. That kind of praise cheapened the real thing. Then she said, "That's exactly right." Cole Dawson did not look up from his work. "I said I could build anything," he said. "You did?" She agreed and went back to her own section. But she noticed a few minutes later that he was working a little differently than he had been when he first arrived. The set of his shoulders had changed. Tommy noticed it too, because he came to stand beside Eleanor at the furnace and said quietly, "He came." "He did," she said. "Do you know why?" She thought about the breakfast that morning. The slight drop of shoulders she'd watched happen around the room as people got enough food for the first time in weeks. "I have a theory," she said. "But we'll see." That night after supper, she was cleaning the kitchen when Nathaniel appeared in the doorway. "A word," he said. She put down the cloth she was using and turned to face him. He came into the kitchen and stood by the table, and he had the careful look of someone who had decided to say something and was still working out the exact way to say it. "The men are talking," he said. "About the smokehouse. About you." He paused. "In a different way than this morning." She waited. "Cole Dawson told Hector Martinez at supper that you knew what you were doing. He said it like he was delivering news that he himself hadn't entirely processed. For Cole Dawson, that is equivalent to a public declaration." She turned back to the counter and picked up the cloth again. "He's a good builder." "He's one of the best men I have," Nathaniel said. "And he doesn't like anyone. "He doesn't not like me," she said. "He doesn't know me yet. There's a difference." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "can I ask you something?" "You can ask." "Does it bother you what he said yesterday when you arrived? What some of the men—" "Yes," she said simply. He seemed surprised by the directness. "Of course it does," she said. "I'm not made of stone. What people say about how you look, it lands somewhere. It always does." She paused. "But I made a decision a long time ago that I was not going to let the landing stop me. The thing about words like that is, they only have the power to stop you if you hand that power over. I stopped handing it over." She folded the cloth. "I didn't say it was easy. I said it was a decision." Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment. "The man who left you," he said quietly, "he was a fool." She looked up. He wasn't looking away. There was no performance in it, no theatrical sympathy meant to make him seem kind. He was just saying a thing he believed to be true. She said, "He was afraid. There's a difference between a fool and a coward." She set the cloth down. "I spent a long time being angry at him. Then I spent a long time thinking the problem was me. Then I stopped doing both of those things and started doing this instead." She gestured at the kitchen, the ranch, the general direction of the smokehouse. "It's better." He nodded slowly. "It is," he said, and there was something in the way he said it that told her he wasn't only talking about her. She did not ask him about it. Not tonight. She said good night, and he said good night, and she went back to her room. But she lay awake for longer than she expected, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the way he'd said it. It is. Like he knew. Like he understood the specific geography of deciding to stop waiting for your life to get smaller to accommodate other people's comfort. She wondered what his story was. She wondered what he had decided and when. She fell asleep wondering. The timber arrived on the third day, which was faster than she'd expected, and Martinez said it was because Nathaniel had ridden to the mill himself instead of sending someone, which was not a small thing given everything else he had to manage. She did not let herself think too much about that. She had racks to build. By the end of the first week, the smokehouse roof was repaired. By the end of the second week, the racks were hung. The furnace was cleaned and tested. The floor had been treated against moisture with a combination of packed earth and ash that her father had taught her, and that worked better than anything more complicated. And the firebox was drawing clean and even and strong. She lit it for the first time on a Tuesday afternoon. She stood inside the smokehouse with Tommy and Martinez and Cole Dawson, who had become a permanent fixture on the crew, without anyone quite deciding that was happening. It had simply become true. And she lit the fire. And they all stood there and watched the smoke begin to rise and move toward the ceiling vents in exactly the right way. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Tommy said quietly, "It works." "Of course it works," Cole said. But his voice was different than it had been on the day Eleanor arrived. The edge was still there, but the contempt had gone out of it. What replaced it was something that might eventually become respect, though it wasn't there yet. "We start curing tomorrow," Eleanor said. "I'm going to need everyone." She had arranged with Nathaniel for 3 of the ranch hands to spend the next several days hunting systematically with a plan targeting the deer population in the eastern section of the territory, where he had told her they were most concentrated. She had given the hunters a list of what to bring back and how to transport it, because how it arrived mattered as much as that it arrived. The first of the cured meat would not be ready for 10 days, but the smokehouse was already changing things. She saw it in the way the men moved through the ranch, a little straighter, a little faster. She heard it in the conversations at supper, which had started to have something in them again, some forward motion, some talk about what came next, instead of only about what was getting worse. Hope was a strange thing. You could not manufacture it directly, but you could build the conditions in which it grew on its own. She was in the middle of prep work, 2 days after the first lighting, when she heard raised voices in the yard. She came out to find 3 of the ranch hands clustered near the barn door, and the object of their attention was a man she hadn't seen before, well dressed by the standards of the territory, with the specific kind of careful grooming that meant money and the specific kind of posture That meant he was very used to getting what he wanted. He was talking to Nathaniel. She could hear pieces of it from where she stood. Should consider the position you're putting your men in, Carter. This is not a conversation I'm interested in having. The bank has been very patient, and my client's offer is more than fair given the state of... She walked forward. She did not walk forward to intervene. She walked forward because she needed to hear what was being said, and standing in the doorway of the smokehouse was not close enough. She stopped about 10 feet away. Nathaniel saw her. Something in his face shifted. The well-dressed man noticed the shift and turned to look at her. He looked at her the way men like him always looked at women like her, a sliding downward assessment that cataloged everything she was not, and concluded the catalog in about 2 seconds. "Who is this?" he said to Nathaniel. "My wife," Nathaniel said. She had not expected that word. They were not married. The ceremony had not happened yet. They had not discussed when it would happen, and in the chaos of the first 2 weeks, it had sat somewhere in the middle distance between them, a thing they both knew was coming, but had not addressed directly. But Nathaniel said it without hesitation and without looking at her for permission, and she understood immediately what he was doing and why, and she made a decision in the space of about half a second. She stepped forward and stood beside him. "And you are," she said. The man's eyes moved from her to Nathaniel and back. "James Aldridge," he said. "I represent Mr. Victor Hale." She had heard that name before in Nathaniel's explanation their first night, and she had filed it away. "Mr. Hale is interested in this property," Aldridge continued with the smooth confidence of a man who had made this speech many times and found it usually worked. "He is prepared to offer a very generous—" "The ranch is not for sale," Eleanor said. Aldridge looked at her with the particular patience of a man who believes he is humoring someone who doesn't understand how things work. "Mrs. Carter," he said with the faintest possible stress on the title. "Perhaps you don't fully understand the financial—" "I understand the financial situation very clearly," she said. "I also understand that a smokehouse operation that has been rebuilt and is already producing is a significant change to the asset picture of this property. I suspect Mr. Hale's offer was calculated before he knew about that. I'd suggest you go back to him with the updated information." Aldridge was quiet. Something had shifted in his smooth, careful face. The humoring patience was gone. "You've been here 2 weeks," he said. 13 days, she said. "Would you like to see the operation? I'm happy to show you what 13 days of real work looks like." He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he looked at Nathaniel. "My client's offer stands through the end of the month. I'd encourage you to consider it carefully." He turned and walked back toward his horse. Nobody in the yard moved until he was gone. Then Tommy, who had come out of the smokehouse at some point and was standing behind Eleanor, said very quietly, "Who was that?" "Someone who works for a problem," Eleanor said. "We'll deal with it." She looked at Nathaniel. He was looking at her. "You called me your wife," she said. "Yes," he said. "We haven't—" "I know." He held her gaze. "I apologize if that was presumptuous." She thought about it for a moment. "It wasn't presumptuous," she said finally. "It was practical." She paused. "Don't apologize for practical." She turned and went back into the smokehouse. But she stood inside the door for a moment, just a moment, with her hand pressed flat against the repaired wall, and she let herself feel the full weight of what had just happened. Not only the threat, though, the threat was real and would have to be managed, but the other thing, the way he'd said it. "My wife." Without hesitation, without apology, without any of the calculation that men usually applied before they attached themselves publicly to a woman who looked the way she looked. "Just my wife." She pressed her hand against the wall and took a slow breath, and then she let it go, because there was work to do, and the smoke was burning steady. And even in the furnace, and in 10 days they would have cured meat, and Victor Hale and James Aldridge and the bank and everyone else who wanted this ranch to fail were going to discover what happened when you underestimated the wrong woman. She picked up her tools. She went back to work. 10 days after Eleanor lit the furnace for the first time, the smokehouse produced its first real batch. She had been up since 3 in the morning. Not because anything had gone wrong. Everything had gone exactly right, which was its own kind of tension. The specific anxiety of someone who had staked a great deal on something, and was now standing at the moment of reckoning, and could not quite bring herself to stop checking the numbers one more time. She had checked the temperature 4 times in the last hour. She had adjusted the airflow twice. She had walked the perimeter of the furnace with her hand extended, reading the heat the way her father had taught her. Not with instruments, but with the accumulated knowledge of 1,000 hours of doing this exact thing, beside a man who understood it better than anyone she'd ever met. Everything was right. She knew it was right. But she checked again anyway. Tommy found her there at 4:30, doing her 4th perimeter check. "It's ready, isn't it?" he said. It was not a question. "It's ready," she said. He exhaled. "I didn't sleep." "Neither did I." He looked at her sideways. "Are you nervous?" She thought about how to answer that honestly. "I know what I built," she said. "I know what I put into that furnace and how long it's been there and what it should be when it comes out. The knowing doesn't make you not nervous. It just gives the nervous somewhere to stand." He turned that over in his head for a moment. Then he said, "That's a strange thing to say." "Probably," she agreed. "Go wake Martinez. I want everyone here when we open it." She had not planned a ceremony. That was not her nature. She was not a woman given to dramatic gestures, and she had learned a long time ago that the most powerful moments were usually the quiet ones, the ones that happened without staging. But when Martinez arrived, and then Cole Dawson, who came without being asked, and stood in the back with his arms at his sides instead of crossed, and then several of the other ranch hands who had clearly been awake and waiting, and finally Nathaniel, who came in last and stood just inside the door and looked at her across the room with an expression she couldn't read. In the low light she understood that the ceremony had arranged itself without her intervention. 22 men. Some of them still half asleep, pulling on jackets, steam rising from coffee cups someone had thought to bring. All of them here at 4:30 in the morning, in a building that 3 weeks ago had been a ruin everyone ignored. She opened the smokehouse. She brought out the first piece herself. She cut it on the work table that Martinez had built along the east wall, using her curing knife, and the sound of it. The sound of the knife moving through properly cured meat, that specific density and resistance, told her everything she needed to know before she even tasted it. She tasted it. She stood there for a moment with her eyes closed. It was right, not close, not good enough. Right. Her father's recipe adjusted for the particulars of this altitude and this wood and this cut, and it was exactly right. She opened her eyes. Nathaniel was watching her from across the room. She picked up the piece she had cut and walked it to him. He took it. He ate it. And then something happened to his face that she had not seen happen to it in the 3 weeks she had known him. Something broke open in it quietly, like a door being pushed open from the inside. And what came through was not performance and not relief exactly, but something older and more private than either of those things. He looked at her. "Eleanor," he said. It was the first time he had used her given name. She held very still. "This is—" He stopped, looked down at the piece of meat in his hand, then back at her. "My father used to talk about a smokehouse operation he visited in Tennessee when he was young. He used to say it was the finest thing he'd ever eaten. He said it tasted like someone understood what they were doing down to the bone." He paused. "I always thought he was exaggerating." The room was quiet. "He wasn't exaggerating," Nathaniel said. And then before Eleanor could respond, Cole Dawson pushed off the wall. He'd been leaning against, walked to the work table, and cut himself a piece without asking permission. He ate it standing there. Everyone watched him. Cole Dawson was not a man who showed things on his face. He had a face built for exactly the opposite purpose, for keeping things contained, for presenting a surface that told you nothing. Eleanor had been reading that face for 3 weeks, and she had managed to extract from it over time things like mild approval and grudging respect, and the specific tight-jawed expression that meant he agreed with something, but had not decided to say so yet. He ate the piece of cured meat. His face did exactly nothing. And then he cut another piece, and he turned to the man standing nearest to him, Hector Martinez, and held it out. Martinez took it, ate it, looked at Eleanor. "Madre de Dios," he said softly. The room broke open after that. Everyone was talking. Everyone was crowding the work table. Tommy was cutting pieces under Eleanor's direction and handing them around, and the sound of 22 men discovering that they were standing inside the solution to the problem that had been quietly crushing them for 6 weeks. That sound was something Eleanor Whitmore filed away in the deepest part of herself, the part where she kept the things that had actually mattered because she already knew she would be pulling it out on hard days for the rest of her life. Nathaniel stayed beside her. Not in front of her the way men who needed to be seen managing a situation tended to position themselves. Beside her. Shoulder to shoulder, slightly back, present in a way that said, "This is hers, I am here because she is here." She noticed. She did not say anything about it, but she noticed. By the time the sun came up, she had a plan. She had been building toward it for 2 weeks, assembling the pieces in the quiet hours, when everyone else was asleep, checking the numbers, the way she checked the furnace temperature methodically repeatedly from every angle. And now, standing in the smokehouse, with the evidence of what she had built all around her, she was ready to say it out loud. "I need to talk to you," she told Nathaniel after breakfast. "About what comes next." He followed her into the main room. She laid out the notebook on the table the way she had on the first night, and she talked him through it. The economics of selling cured meat to the mining camps in the Northern Territory where the railroad workers were concentrated, where preserved food was not just valuable, but desperately needed because the supply chains into those areas were unreliable. She had numbers. She had estimated costs and estimated returns and a timeline for scaling the operation from feeding 22 men to producing enough surplus to sell. Nathaniel listened. He listened the way he always listened, not waiting for her to stop so he could say what he was already thinking, but actually following each point and letting it change what he was thinking before the next one arrived. When she finished, he said, "How long?" 6 weeks to have surplus ready for sale. 8 weeks to have enough volume to make the first delivery worth the trip. She paused. By spring, this ranch has a second income stream that does not depend on cattle prices or weather patterns in the same way the livestock business does. It's not a replacement, it's insurance. It's what keeps you standing when one thing goes wrong. He was quiet. Then, "Victor Hale is going to find out. He's going to find out anyway," she said. "The only question is whether he finds out before or after we have enough momentum that it doesn't matter." Nathaniel looked at the notebook. "If this works." "When this works." He looked up. "When this works?" he said carefully, and she heard him choosing the word, deliberately choosing, to let himself believe the thing she was telling him. "The bank pressure changes. If we can show income from the smokehouse, the note looks different." "Yes, and Hale's offer looks different. What he wants is a struggling ranch he can buy at collapse price. A ranch with a producing operation is a different proposition." "Yes." He sat back. He looked at her for a long moment, with that complicated, layered expression she had been learning to read over the course of 3 weeks, the one that had exhaustion and intelligence and something cautious running through it in parallel streams. "You knew all of this when you arrived," he said. It wasn't an accusation. It was something more like wonder. "I knew what the smokehouse could be," she said. "I didn't know if the rest of it was there. The men, the capacity, the will." She paused. "I had to see it first. And now you've seen it. Now I've seen it." He looked at her for another moment. Then he reached out and put his hand flat on the table briefly beside the notebook, not touching her hand, which was also on the table, but closed the gesture of a man who was saying something he didn't have the words for yet. She did not move her hand. He pulled his back. "All right," he said. "Tell me what you need." What she needed, as it turned out, was a problem she hadn't anticipated. The hunting crews had been doing well better than she had projected, which was the best kind of problem to have, and the volume of meat coming into the smokehouse was pushing the upper edge of what the current rack capacity could handle. She needed more racks. She needed them built quickly before the next hunting return came in. She went to find Cole. She found him in the barn, working on a piece of harness that needed repair. She stood in the doorway, and he looked up and did not say anything, which was she had learned Cole Dawson's version of being receptive. "I need racks," she said. 12 more same dimensions as the first set. I need them in 2 days. He looked at her. 2 days is tight, he said. I know. I've got other work. I know that too. She paused. I'm asking anyway. He looked at the harness in his hands, then at her. Why do you always do that, he said. Do what? Say you know it's a lot, and then ask anyway. Most people either pretend it's not a lot, or they apologize for asking. You do neither. She considered this. Because pretending doesn't help you and apologizing doesn't help me, she said. It's a lot. You might say no. That's a real possibility I'm accounting for. But the racks need to be built, and you build better than anyone here, so I'm asking. Cole stared at her for a moment. Then he set down the harness. 2 days, he said. I'll need Tommy. You can have him. He stood up and she turned to go, and he said, Mrs. Carter. She turned back. He was looking at her with something on his face that was not quite any of the things she had seen there before. Something more unguarded than his usual expression. What you said when you got here, he said. About carrying heavier things than my opinion. He stopped, started again. I had a sister. She had the same kind of people said things about how she looked her whole life. The same kind of things I said to you. He did not look away. She left home when she was 17 because she couldn't stand it anymore. I never found out where she went. Eleanor stood very still. I'm not saying it fixes anything, he said quickly before she could respond. I wanted you to know that I knew it was wrong when I said it. That's worse, maybe. Knowing and saying it anyway. She thought about what to say for a long moment. What was her name? She said. He blinked, clearly not the question he'd expected. Clara, he said. I hope she found somewhere good, Eleanor said. I hope she found people who saw her right. Cole Dawson nodded once. His jaw was tight in a different way than usual. 2 days, he said again, and went to find his tools. Eleanor walked back across the yard. She felt the cold on her face, and the hard ground under her boots, and the enormous sky pressing down the way Wyoming sky did that specific weight of open space, and she thought about Clara Dawson, who had left home at 17 rather than stay somewhere. She was told what she was worth, and she thought about herself at 24, sitting in a parlor in St. Louis, listening to a man explain to her with great kindness and great cowardice why she was not ultimately who he wanted to be seen with. She thought about how many women there were in the world walking around carrying that particular weight. How many people, actually? How many people who had been told the wrong thing so many times for so long that the wrong thing had started to feel like the truth? She went back to the Smokehouse. She had work to do. The first sale happened on a Wednesday. Nathaniel had ridden out the previous Friday to the mining camp at Harrow Creek 40 miles north with a sample pack that Eleanor had assembled, 6 different cuts each, cured slightly differently, each labeled in her handwriting with the method and the estimated shelf life. He came back Sunday night. Eleanor was in the kitchen when he came in. He sat down at the table and she poured him coffee, and he looked at the cup for a moment, and then he looked at her. They want 50 pounds a week, he said. She had been expecting 25. She made herself finish pouring the coffee before she responded. Starting when? She said. They want the first delivery in 2 weeks. He paused. The camp foreman said he said, and I'm quoting him directly, that if the product is what the sample suggests, they'll take everything you can make. She set the coffee pot down. Everything we can make, she said. His words. She sat down across from him at the table. The mathematics of what he had just said were rearranging themselves in her head in real time, moving pieces from one column to another, changing numbers she had built her projections on. 50 pounds a week at the price she'd quoted Nathaniel was more than she had planned for. It changed the timeline. It changed what she could tell him about the banknote. It changed a lot of things. We'll need to expand the capacity again, she said. I'll need to talk to Cole about Eleanor. She stopped. He was looking at her the way he had looked at her in the Smokehouse that morning, when he'd used her given name for the first time, that door-opening look, something coming through from somewhere interior. "You have been here for 3 weeks," he said. "In 3 weeks, you have rebuilt a structure that everyone, including me, had written off entirely. You have fed 22 men properly for the first time in 2 months. You have begun a curing operation that is already producing at a quality level I did not know was possible. And you have just sold our first product at twice the volume I projected." She waited. "I want to make sure you understand," he said carefully, "that I know what is happening here. I know what you are doing. And I know that what you are doing is not something that happens because someone happens to be in the right place at the right time. This is you. This is what you know and what you can do and who you are. And I want you to know that I know that." Eleanor Whitmore looked at Nathaniel Carter across the kitchen table. She had been told kind things before. She had been told she was capable and efficient and hardworking and useful. She had been praised for her output her entire life in the specific way that you praise something that is functioning the way it's supposed to. This was not that. He was not praising her output. He was saying something about her specifically. Not what she produced, not what she provided, her. She said, "Thank you, Nathaniel." First time she'd used his name, too. They both noticed. Neither of them said anything about it. But the temperature in the room changed subtly, the way temperature changes in a space when a furnace catches fully and the heat starts to move. Victor Hale's response to the news came faster than either of them expected. Aldridge arrived on a Thursday morning this time with a second man Eleanor didn't recognize younger, with the look of someone who carried messages for people and had learned to make himself forgettable while doing it. She was crossing the yard when they rode in, and she stopped and watched Nathaniel come out of the barn to meet them. She did not go to him immediately. She watched from where she was reading the body language of the conversation, Aldridge talking, Nathaniel listening, the tight controlled stillness of a man who was hearing something he didn't like and was deciding how to receive it. Then Aldridge looked across the yard at her. He said something to Nathaniel. Nathaniel's posture changed. She walked forward. She did not walk fast. She walked at the pace of someone who had decided to arrive at a particular moment and was not going to be rushed into arriving before she was ready. When she reached them, Aldridge turned to her with his smooth expression and his careful voice and said, "Mrs. Carter, I was just telling your husband about some concerns that have come to Mr. Hale's attention, about the Smokehouse operation." "What concerns?" she said. "There are some questions about the legality of the commercial operation you're running. The territory has regulations regarding commercial food preparation, and Mr. Hale has reason to believe that your operation may not be in compliance." She looked at him. "What specific regulation are you referring to?" she said. A flicker. Very brief. "The territorial commercial food provisions. I'm familiar with those provisions," she said. "I reviewed them before we began the commercial operation. We are in compliance. If Mr. Hale has identified a specific provision he believes we're violating, I'd be glad to review it with you." She paused. "In writing. Submitted to the territorial office in Cheyenne for their assessment." The flicker again. More pronounced this time. "That won't be necessary." "I think it will be," she said. "Because if Mr. Hale is making a legal claim against this operation, I want that claim documented. And if it turns out to be without basis, I want that documented too. For the record." She held his gaze. "Do you understand what I'm saying, Mr. Aldridge?" He understood. A man who manufactured legal objections to intimidate people did not want those objections put in writing and sent to a government office. Written official documented objections had a way of becoming evidence of their own bad faith. Aldridge looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Nathaniel. "My client's offer," he said, and his voice had lost some of its careful smoothness, "expires at the end of the month." "We know," Nathaniel said. They rode away. Eleanor watched them go. Nathaniel stood beside her and watched them go. When the riders were out of sight, Tommy's voice came from behind her. "They're going to try something else." She turned. He was standing behind her, had apparently appeared at some point during the confrontation, and he was looking at the road where the riders had been, with an expression that was older than 16. "Yes," she said. "They are." "What do you think they'll do?" She thought about Victor Hale, a man she had never met but had assembled a clear picture of from Nathaniel's descriptions, and Aldridge's manner and the specific texture of the pressure that had been applied to this ranch over the past several months. A man who was used to getting what he wanted through patience and pressure, who had been waiting for this property to collapse under its own weight, and had not expected someone to show up and start rebuilding it. Men like Victor Hale did not respond well to not getting what they wanted. They did not increase the offer. They did not walk away. They found another angle. "I don't know yet," she said, "but I want the smokehouse locked at night from here on, and I want someone who can be trusted keeping an eye on the approach road." Nathaniel looked at her. "You think he'd—" "I think he wants this land," she said. "I think the smokehouse has made this ranch more valuable and also made it clear that the ranch is not going to fail on its own anymore. Those two things together are the kind of thing that makes a certain type of man stop being patient." She looked at him directly. "We need to be ready." He nodded. His jaw was set, but it was not the tight jaw of someone who was afraid. It was the jaw of someone who had made a decision. "I'll talk to Cole," he said. "He's been wanting something to actually do about Hale for a long time." "Tell him not to do anything," she said quickly. "Not yet. Not unless something happens first. The moment we act, instead of react, we give Hale something to point to." Nathaniel looked at her. "You know," he said slowly, "I have never in my life met a woman who thought about business strategy the way a general thinks about a campaign. My father used to say running a smokehouse was 90% planning and 10% fire management." She turned back toward the smokehouse. He was being generous about the fire. She heard him laugh behind her. It was the first time she had heard him actually laugh. Not the quiet, almost smile she'd catalogued before, but a real laugh surprised out of him genuine. It came and went quickly, but it was real. She kept walking because if she stopped, she would have to deal with what that laugh had done to something in her chest, and she was not ready to do that in the middle of a yard in front of 3 ranch hands and a 16-year-old boy. The night it happened was 3 days later. She smelled it before she heard it woke from a sleep that had been shallow anyway, sat up in the dark, and knew before she was fully conscious what she was smelling. Smoke. Not smokehouse smoke. Wrong kind. Wrong smell. The specific chemical sharpness of something burning that was not supposed to be burning. She was dressed and out the door in less than a minute. The smokehouse was on fire. Not fully, not yet, but the eastern corner, the corner that had been the most recently repaired, was showing flame at the base, and the way it was burning, the way the fire was moving, told her immediately that it had not started from accident. She shouted. Once hard and clear, the kind of shout that reached sleeping men in their bunks. Then she ran toward the water barrel beside the barn. The next 20 minutes were the longest 20 minutes of her life. Men poured out of the bunkhouse. Cole Dawson arrived before anyone else, and took one look at the fire and one look at Eleanor, and did not ask a single question, just grabbed the second bucket and started running. Martinez was there, and Tommy, and then Nathaniel, who came from the main house at a run with his boots half-laced, and his face set in the look she now understood, meant he was in a situation that required everything he had. They ran water. They ran it until every bucket and barrel on the property was empty, and the fire was out, and the eastern wall was standing damaged. The new repair scorched badly on the outside, but standing the brick beneath the timber skin intact, because brick did not burn the same way wood did. The smokehouse was standing. The racks inside were intact. The cured product was intact. Eleanor stood in the yard with her hair loose. It had come down at some point during the running. She hadn't noticed, and she looked at the scorched wall of the building she had built, and she felt for the first time since arriving at Black Creek Ranch, something that lived in the neighborhood of rage. Not the kind of rage that made you loud. The quiet kind. The cold kind. The kind that settles in and starts looking for where to go. Nathaniel came to stand beside her. He was breathing hard. She was breathing hard. The yard smelled of smoke and wet ash. "Eleanor," he said. "I know," she said. We can't prove—" "I know," she said again. She looked at the scorched wall. "The product is intact," she said. "Yes." "The racks." "Yes." She stood there for a moment with the cold rage moving through her, organizing itself, finding its shape. "Then we repair the wall," she said. "Again. And we make the delivery to Harrow Creek on schedule. And we don't give Victor Hale the satisfaction of a single day of delay." She turned to look at the men gathered in the yard. 22 faces in the dark, some of them frightened, some of them angry, all of them looking at her. "He thought this would stop us," she said loud enough for all of them to hear. "He thought a fire in the night would make us fold." Nobody spoke. "He doesn't know this ranch," she said. "He doesn't know these men." She paused. "And he sure as hell doesn't know me." Cole Dawson, standing to her left, made a sound that might have been in another man a laugh. Tommy beside him straightened up to his full height. Nathaniel on her right said quietly, so only she could hear, "No, he definitely does not." She looked at him. He was looking at the scorched wall, but there was something in his profile in the firelight. Something in the set of his jaw and the way his hands were at his sides, open, not clenched, that told her he was not only thinking about Victor Hale. She looked back at the smokehouse. The cold rage was still there, settled in, looking for its direction. She had found it. The wall repair took 2 days. Cole Dawson worked it like a man with something to prove to himself, not to anyone else. He was there before sunrise on the first morning and still working when Eleanor came out at 9 at night to tell him to stop before he broke something he'd need tomorrow. He looked at her in the lamplight, with his face all ash and sweat, and said, "I'm fine." And she said, "I know you're fine. I need you functional at dawn. Go sleep." He went. Tommy worked beside him both days without being asked. He did not talk much while he worked, which was a new development. Tommy usually talked a steady, low stream of questions and observations that Eleanor had come to find as natural as background noise. But those 2 days, he was quiet, and she understood that the quiet was his way of processing what had happened, of taking the fact of the fire and placing it somewhere he could live with. She let him be quiet. She worked, too. She worked because standing still was not something she had ever been able to do when there was something in front of her that needed doing, and also because the cold rage was still there, organized now into something useful. And the most reliable thing she knew to do with that kind of energy was point it at a problem. The wall was repaired by end of the second day. Better than it had been before the fire, actually, because Cole had sourced better timber from the mill delivery that had come in just that morning, and because Martinez had reinforced the corner joinery in a way that the original repair had not accounted for. The scorched exterior was gone. The brick beneath was sound. The smokehouse stood as solidly as it had ever stood. Eleanor walked its perimeter that second evening doing her check, pressing her hand against the walls, and she felt the specific satisfaction of a thing rebuilt, not just restored, but improved, made better by the fact of its destruction, carrying forward the knowledge of what had broken it. She thought about that. She thought about how many things in her life had worked exactly that way. Nathaniel found her there, as he sometimes did in the evenings, in that particular way he had of appearing not to check on her, but simply to be present in the same space she was in. "Cole wants to go to town tomorrow," he said. She looked up. "Why?" "He has a theory about where the fire started from. There's a man in Harlow, a man who does work for Hale, who Cole says has been asking questions about the ranch over the past few weeks, at the feed store, at the saloon." He paused. "Cole wants to ask him some questions back." "Cole needs to not do that," she said. "I know. Tell him the moment he walks into that saloon with questions, Hale has a story. He's been waiting for us to give him a story. Right now, all Hale has is that his fire didn't stop us. Let's keep it that way." She looked at him. "Can you manage Cole?" "Nobody manages Cole," Nathaniel said. "But I can talk to him." "Talk to him tonight." He nodded. He stayed where he was. She waited. "There's something else," he said. "Tell me." He was quiet for a moment, in the specific way of someone choosing the right words carefully, rather than the first words that arrived. "The bank sent a letter while you were working on the wall. I didn't want to put it in front of you until the repair was done." He reached into his coat and held out an envelope. "I want you to read it." She took it. She read it standing there in the cold. Standing. The letter was from the First Territorial Bank of Cheyenne. It was signed by the bank manager, a man named Coalfield, and it was written in the precise, bloodless language that financial institutions used when they were about to do something they preferred you not describe as predatory. The language said that given the ongoing concerns about the viability of the Carter Ranch operation, the bank was exercising its option to review the note terms at the next quarterly period. It said that a representative would be coming to inspect the property and the operation within the next 30 days. It said that the bank's position would be reassessed based on that inspection. She read it twice. Then she folded it and held it back out to him. "Hale's connected to this bank," she said. "Yes. And the inspection is really just a mechanism to give him a formal look at the operation's current state. That's what I think." "How long until the quarterly period?" 23 days. She stood there and thought. 23 days. The Harrow Creek delivery was scheduled for next week, the second of what would be ongoing weekly deliveries. If the delivery happened and the payment came through, which she had no reason to doubt given the camp foreman's enthusiasm, she would have real income to show. Real numbers. Not projections, not plans, not the outline of a thing that could be. Actual transactions. Actual revenue. 23 days was enough time. Barely, but enough. "We need to make sure the delivery happens on schedule," she said. "And we need the payment documented properly. Not just received documented. Receipts, correspondence, the camp foreman's signature." She looked at him. "Do you have someone who can handle that side of it? The paperwork?" "I can handle it myself." "You'll be needed here for the inspection preparation." "Then Tommy," he said. "He's better with numbers and paper than anyone on this ranch, including me. He's been helping me with the ledgers since November." She filed that away. It explained some things about Tommy that she hadn't quite understood before. "All right," she said. "Tommy handles the documentation. You and I handle the inspection preparation. We have 23 days to make this operation look exactly like what it is, which is a going concern with a real future." She paused. "Hale is counting on us being rattled. He burned the wall thinking we'd spend these 23 days reeling. He miscalculated." Nathaniel looked at her. "He did," he said quietly. "He really did." She handed him back the letter. "Go talk to Cole," she said. "And Nathaniel, thank you for waiting until the wall was done." He looked at the envelope in his hand. "I didn't want to add to what you were already carrying." "I noticed," she said. "Thank you for that." He nodded once and went. She turned back to the smokehouse. 23 days. She had built this operation from nothing in 3 weeks. 23 days was a long time when you knew exactly what you were doing. She went inside and started the next batch. The delivery to Harrow Creek happened on a Tuesday 8 days later. Nathaniel went himself with Martinez driving the wagon and Tommy riding alongside with a satchel full of papers that Eleanor had helped him prepare a full accounting of the operation organized the way she had learned to organize records from watching her father manage his clear and sequential and impossible to misread. She stayed at the ranch. She stayed because the second batch was in the smokehouse and someone who understood it needed to be there. And also because she had learned in the weeks since arriving at Black Creek Ranch that there were some things you had to let go of and trust to the people around you. And this was one of those things. That was not an easy lesson for her. She had spent most of her life being the person other people handed things off to, not the person who handed things off. She had been the one who stayed and handled it. Trusting someone else to handle something important still felt like standing at the edge of something without being able to see the bottom. But she trusted Nathaniel. She trusted Tommy. So she stayed and worked and did not watch the road more than she needed to. Cole Dawson stayed too, which surprised her. She had expected him to find something to do that would take him away from the ranch for the day. He was not a man who was comfortable with waiting, and he had made his feelings about Victor Hale and the fire and the general situation very clear through the quality of his silence over the past week. But he stayed. He found work near the Smokehouse. And once in the late afternoon, when she came out to check something and found him sitting on the fence nearby, she said, "You don't have to stay." And he said, "I know." And she understood that was his answer. Nathaniel came back that evening. He came in while she was in the kitchen, and she heard his boots on the floor and turned around and looked at his face, and she knew immediately from his face, from that door-opening quality she had learned to read before he said a single word. "They paid," he said. Full amount, and they want to increase the order." He came to the table and set down the satchel and opened it and pulled out a letter which he held out to her. "The camp foreman wrote this himself." He said, "Read it." She read it. The camp foreman, a man named Garrett, who wrote in the direct, no ornamentation style of someone who had spent most of his life in working camps, wrote that the quality of the product was unlike anything they had received from any supplier, that the men had been asking where it came from, that he had told them Black Creek Ranch, and that 3 other camp foremen in the territory had already contacted him, asking for the supplier's information. She put the letter down on the table. She pressed both hands flat on the tabletop. She breathed. Tommy, who had come in behind Nathaniel, watched her from the doorway with big eyes. "Mrs. Carter," he said, with the uncertain tone of someone who wasn't sure if what they were seeing was good news or something that required concern. "It's all right," she said. "Give me a moment." She gave herself a moment. Then she picked up the letter again and read the last part, which she had skimped on the first time through, because the first part had required all her attention. The camp foreman had written, "I don't know who your supplier is or what they know that the others don't, but whatever it is, don't let them go." She set the letter down again. Nathaniel was watching her. "Don't let them go," he said quietly, and there was something in the way he said it that went sideways from the letter that was about something other than the business relationship with Harrow Creek. She looked at him. He looked back. Tommy made a sound that was not quite a cough and said he would go check on the smokehouse and left, and the kitchen was quiet. "Nathaniel," she said. "Yes." "What happens after the bank inspection?" He understood she was asking about more than the inspection. "That depends," he said, "on a number of things." "Tell me which things." He was quiet for a moment. She had learned that his quiet was never empty. It was working quiet, the quiet of a man sorting through something that needed to be said right, because the wrong version of it would damage something that mattered. "When I placed that advertisement," he said slowly, "I was drowning. I told you that on the first night, and it was true. I needed someone who could cook, who understood preservation, who could help me survive the winter. That was what I was looking for." He paused. "I was not looking for, I did not think I had any right to look for." He stopped, started again. "My wife, Margaret. She died 3 years ago. The winter after she died, I didn't sleep more than 2 or 3 hours any given night for 4 months. I kept the ranch going because I had 22 men depending on me, and I could not let myself stop. But there was nothing, there was no reason for it beyond the responsibility, beyond not letting people down." Eleanor listened. She said nothing. "I had stopped thinking." He said that there was anything beyond the responsibility, that there was supposed to be anything beyond it. He looked at his hands on the table. "And then you stepped off that wagon and walked past 22 men like they were furniture and stood inside a ruined smokehouse and told me you could save it. And something—" He stopped. "Something woke up that I had put down and forgotten I'd put down." The kitchen was very quiet. "I'm not telling you this as a claim," he said quickly, looking up. "I'm not saying you owe me anything, or that, because I have these feelings, you are obligated to— Nathaniel." He stopped. "I have spent the last several years," she said, "being told what I was worth. By a man who left me. By a city that looked past me. By the particular way that the world has of making people like me understand that they are tolerated rather than wanted." She paused. I came here because I needed somewhere my skills would matter. I thought that was enough. I thought that was what I was allowed to want." She looked at him. "I was wrong about that." He was very still. "I have been wrong about that for a while," she said. "I just had no evidence to revise the assumption until—" She stopped. "Until recently." Nathaniel Carter looked at Eleanor Whitmore across a kitchen table in Wyoming Territory in the year 1881, and neither of them said anything else for a moment because some things that are true don't need a sentence around them to be understood. Then he reached across the table and put his hand over hers. Just that. She turned her hand over and held his. They stayed like that for a while. Outside, Wyoming was doing what Wyoming did in February, pressing cold against the walls, moving vast and indifferent under an enormous sky. Inside the kitchen, the stove was warm and the lamp was lit, and two people who had each for different reasons stopped expecting anything beyond what was strictly necessary were sitting at a table holding on to something that was not strictly necessary at all. It was everything, actually. It was the whole point. The bank inspector arrived on a Thursday. His name was Hartwell, and he was a small, precise man with a leather case and the meticulous manner of someone who had built his career on finding things wrong. He arrived at 9 in the morning and went immediately to work, and Eleanor let him work because she had spent the previous 23 days making absolutely certain there was nothing for him to find wrong. The ledgers were immaculate. Tommy had spent 3 days going over them with Eleanor, and what had come out of that process was a financial record that was not only accurate but legible and organized in a way that told the story of the ranch's trajectory, the depths of the winter crisis, the beginning of the Smokehouse operation, the first sale, the second order, the projected revenue over the coming months in a sequence so clear that you would have to be willfully blind to miss it. Hartwell was not willfully blind. She watched him go through the ledgers at the kitchen table, and she watched his precise face make small adjustments as the numbers accumulated. The tight professional neutrality that he had arrived with began to develop something more complex beneath it. Not enthusiasm. He did not seem to be a man given to enthusiasm, but something like reluctant recalibration. The numbers did not match what he had clearly been prepared to find. Nathaniel sat across from him and answered every question directly and completely, without elaboration or defensiveness. Eleanor sat at the stove and listened. When Hartwell asked to see the smokehouse operation, she stood up. "I'll show you," she said. She walked him through it the same way she had walked Tommy through it on that first morning, thoroughly, plainly, without performance. She explained the process, the timeline, the yield per batch, the pricing structure, the client relationships, the expansion capacity. She answered every question he asked, and she answered them fully, and when he asked a question that she found interesting, which happened twice, because Hartwell was precise enough to ask things she had not anticipated, she said so. At the end of the tour, he stood in the middle of the smokehouse and looked around at the racks and the furnace and the organized work surface and the careful records she kept on the wall, temperature logs, timing logs, batch records going back to the first day, and he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Mrs. Carter." "Yes." "This is not what I expected to find." "I know," she said. "The bank's assessment of this property's viability was based on a situation that no longer exists." He looked at her with his precise, not unkind eyes. "The situation that currently exists is substantially different." "Yes," she said, "it is." He nodded slowly. He made a note in his case. "I will need to speak with Mr. Carter regarding the revised note terms," he said. "I expect the bank will want to renegotiate." She walked him back to the house. She did not allow herself to feel the relief yet. She had learned long ago that relief felt before a thing was fully done was a way of spending energy you needed for the last stretch, and the last stretch was always when something could still go wrong. But when she came back into the kitchen and met Nathaniel's eyes across the room, she let him see what she was thinking, because after 47 days in the same house, he could read her well enough to see it anyway. He gave the smallest possible nod. She went back to the smokehouse. An hour later, Cole Dawson appeared in the doorway. She looked up from what she was doing. He was holding something in his hand, an envelope not new-looking, worn at the edges, like it had been carried for a while. "What's that?" she said. "Letter," he said. "From Clara." She went still. "You found her?" she said. "She wrote me," he said. He looked at the envelope. 2 months ago. I didn't open it for a month." He paused. "She's in Colorado. She's all right. She works in a bakery." He looked up at Eleanor. "She said in the letter that she found people who saw her write." Eleanor felt something tighten in her throat. "Cole?" she said. "I'm going to write her back," he said quickly, like he needed to say it before the impulse left. "I've been sitting on it because I didn't know what to say, but I think I know now." He stopped. "You made me think I knew what to say now." She looked at him. "Don't tell her you're sorry in the first line," she said. "Tell her you're glad she's all right. Start there." He looked at the envelope. "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, that's right." He turned and went. She watched him go. Then she pressed the back of her hand to her mouth for a moment, because the accumulated weight of the past several days was trying to find an exit, and she was not going to let it find one here in the middle of the smokehouse at 3 in the afternoon. She took 3 slow breaths. She went back to work. Hartwell left that afternoon with his leather case and his revised notes, and the specific expression of a man who had come to deliver a decision and instead discovered he needed to go back and make a different one. Nathaniel walked him to his horse. He came back inside and found Eleanor in the kitchen and sat down at the table and put his head in his hands for a moment. Not from despair, she could tell the difference by now, but from the particular exhaustion of sustained tension finally carefully beginning to release. She poured him coffee and set it in front of him, and sat down. He lifted his head. "He's going to recommend revised terms," he said. "Lower interest. Extended timeline." He said the bank had been working from an outdated assessment and that it would need to be corrected. He stopped. Hale pushed that assessment. He had people at the bank presenting the worst possible picture of this property situation to get the note called. Hartwell knows that now. He didn't say it outright, but he knows. "Will he do anything about it?" she said. "He'll revise the note," Nathaniel said. "He'll correct the record, whether anything happens to Hale beyond losing this particular play." He shook his head. "Men like Hale have enough money to absorb losing a play. He'll find another property to circle." "But not this one," she said. "Not this one." He looked at her. "Not anymore." She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "Victor Hale is going to be angry," she said. "Yes. He doesn't lose things he's decided to have." "No. So we should expect something else." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. "What do you think he'll do?" She thought about it honestly, the same way she thought about every problem, looking at it from the inside out, starting with what was true and working toward what was likely. "He can't attack the operation directly anymore," she said. "The fire didn't stop us, and now Hartwell has seen the operation running cleanly. If something else happened to the smokehouse, it looks like exactly what it is. He can't manufacture a legal objection because I called that bluff. He can't buy the property because the bank is revising the note." She paused. "What he has left is reputation." Nathaniel looked at her. "He's going to try to say something about you," she said. "About us. About why a desperate rancher chose a woman who looked like me. He's going to try to make it about that because that's the only angle he has left that doesn't require any evidence." The silence in the kitchen was different than it had been before. "Let him," Nathaniel said. She looked at him. "Eleanor." He said her name the way he had in the smokehouse the morning of the first batch, with an intention in it with weight. "Let him say whatever he wants. I know what this ranch is. I know what you built here. And I know exactly who you are." He held her gaze. "I'm not afraid of what Victor Hale thinks about why I chose you. I'm not afraid of what anyone thinks." She looked at him for a long time. "Some people will believe him," she said. "Not as a challenge, as a fact. Some people believe all kinds of things," he said, That's not something I can fix. What I can fix is making sure that the people who matter to us know the truth. And the truth is right there in that smokehouse, and in those ledgers, and in the faces of 22 men who've been eating properly for 6 weeks." He paused. "The truth has a habit of being visible if you give it enough time." She had believed that her whole life. She had believed it even when it cost her things to believe it. She had believed it in the years after the engagement ended, when she was trying to find her footing in a world that kept showing her the wrong face. She had believed it when she packed her trunk and bought a train ticket to a territory she'd never been to rebuild a smokehouse for a man she'd never met. She had believed it, and she was sitting here now at this table with this man with the smell of wood smoke on her hands, and the sound of the Wyoming wind against the walls, and the knowledge, the real documented, undeniable knowledge, that she had been right to believe it. "All right," she said. "All right. All right," she said again. "Let him try." She reached across the table. She put her hand in his. Outside, the wind pressed against the walls of Black Creek Ranch, and inside, 2 people sat in a warm kitchen and held on, and the smokehouse stood solid in the dark behind the barn, carrying everything they had built toward everything that was coming next. Victor Hale came himself. That was the thing nobody expected. Not Aldridge, not another lawyer, not a letter with careful language and implied threats. Victor Hale rode on to Black Creek Ranch on a Monday morning in late March, with 2 men flanking him, and the particular posture of someone who had decided that if you wanted something done right, you stopped sending other people to do it. Eleanor was in the smokehouse when she heard the horses. She came out. He was older than she had pictured him, somewhere past 60, with the kind of physical solidity that money and authority built in certain men over decades. The look of someone who had never been told no so many times that it had stopped being a surprise. He sat his horse well. He had good boots. His eyes moved over the ranch the way Aldridge's had moved over Eleanor on that first visit, cataloging, assessing, deciding. His eyes found her. He looked at her for a moment with an expression that was not quite contempt and not quite curiosity. Something that combined both in the particular way of men who had spent a long time at the top of something and had mistaken that position for a form of perception. Nathaniel came out of the barn. He crossed the yard and stood beside Eleanor. He did not stand in front of her. Hale looked at him. "Carter?" "Mr. Hale," Nathaniel said. "This is a surprise." "I doubt that." Hale swung down from his horse with the ease of a man who had been riding since before either of them was born. He handed the reins to one of his men without looking at him. "I came to have a plain conversation. I've found that plain conversations are more productive than correspondence." "I agree," Nathaniel said. "Come inside." "I'd rather not." Hale's eyes went to the smokehouse. "I'd rather you show me what I came to see," Eleanor said. "What did you come to see, Mr. Hale?" He looked at her. "You," he said. Simply, directly. "I came to see what a woman who cost me $100,000 in land value looks like up close." The yard was very quiet. Cole Dawson was standing by the fence, she noticed. Martinez was near the barn door. Tommy was somewhere behind her. She could feel him there without turning around. The 22 men of Black Creek Ranch had arranged themselves in the specific pattern of people who were not making a demonstration, but were also not going anywhere. "I'll show you the smokehouse," she said. She walked him through it. She did it the same way she had done it for Hartwell, plainly, completely without performance. She showed him the furnace and the racks and the records on the wall. She showed him the current batch in progress. She showed him the ledger page Tommy had copied out for the wall, the running total of deliveries and payments, the curve of it climbing steadily upward over the past 6 weeks. Hale looked at all of it. He did not speak for a long time. She waited. She was good at waiting. "My man set that fire?" he said finally. She had expected a great many things from this conversation, but not that. She looked at him. "I'm telling you directly," he said, "because I believe in plain conversation, and because anything else would be an insult to your intelligence." He looked at the scorched patch on the eastern wall, still faintly visible, where the new timber met the old brick. He set the fire. I told him to discourage the operation, not to destroy it, and he exercised more initiative than I asked for. I've addressed that with him. You've addressed it, Eleanor said. Yes. And you're telling me this? Yes. Why? He looked at her directly. Because I want you to understand that I am not a man who operates through ignorance. I knew what was happening here. I knew what you were building. And I made a series of decisions that were based on the assumption that this was a temporary situation, that one more winter in Carter's ranch would collapse the way ranches in this territory have been collapsing for 3 years. He paused. I was wrong about that. She looked at him for a long moment. Mr. Hale, she said. Are you here to apologize? Something moved through his face. Something that was not quite embarrassment and not quite amusement. I'm here to make a business proposal, he said. She had not expected that either. She crossed her arms. I'm listening, she said. He looked at her with something that she recognized reluctantly as genuine respect. The real kind, not the performed kind. The kind that arrived against your will because the evidence demanded it. I have 12 properties in this territory, he said. 4 of them have smokehouse structures in various states of disrepair. The other 8 have the land and the water access to support an operation like this one. What I do not have is someone who knows what you know. He paused. I'm proposing a consulting arrangement. You advise the setup of operations on those properties. In return, I leave this ranch alone, completely. And I use my relationship with the bank, which is substantial, to ensure the note on this property is renegotiated to favorable terms. The smokehouse was very quiet. You want to use my knowledge, she said. Yes. After you tried to burn down the thing I built. Yes. He did not look away. I recognized the considerable irony of that position. She studied him. The proposal was real. She could hear that it was real the same way she could hear when the heat in the furnace was right through the accumulation of evidence that told her the thing she was feeling was not wishful thinking. He had come here himself. He had admitted to the fire directly. He was not a man who did things for no reason. She turned and looked at Nathaniel, who was standing in the doorway of the smokehouse. He was looking at her. Not at Hale. At her. He was going to let her decide this. She understood that completely, and she understood what it meant. Not that he was withholding his opinion, but that he trusted her, read of the situation more than his own, and that he was saying so in the only language that mattered. She turned back to Hale. I'll consider your proposal, she said. In writing. Submitted to me directly, not through Aldridge. And the bank arrangement happens first before I advise anything. The note is renegotiated before I set foot on any other property. She paused. Those are my terms. He looked at her. All right, he said. She had expected negotiation. That's it, she said. Mrs. Carter, he said, and there was something almost dry in his voice, the thin edge of a man who knew how to recognize when he'd been beaten and had enough intelligence to stop making it worse. I came here today because every approach I have taken with this ranch for the past 6 months has failed. I'm a man who learns from failure. The lesson here is fairly clear. He looked at the smokehouse around him, the records on the wall, the working furnace, the whole solid functioning reality of something she had built from nothing. You are not someone to work against. You are someone to work with. He settled his hat. I'd rather be in the second category. He walked out. She stood in the smokehouse and listened to the sound of 3 horses leaving the yard. Then Tommy appeared in the doorway, and his expression was the exact expression of someone who had been listening from just outside and had heard everything and was still processing it. Did Victor Hale just... He started. Yes, she said. Did he admit to the fire and then ask you for a business deal in the same conversation? Yes. Tommy was quiet for a moment. That's the strangest thing I've ever seen, he said. It's not strange, she said. It's practical. He's a practical man who ran out of other options. Practical people eventually arrive at the truth. It just takes some of them longer than others. She walked past him into the yard. Cole Dawson was still at the fence. She walked over to him. He looked at her sideways. "Well," he said. "It's handled?" she said. His jaw moved. "Did you—" "It's handled, Cole." He looked at the road where Hale had gone. Then he looked back at her, and for a moment his face did the thing it very rarely did, which was show something without filtering it first. "Good," he said. That was all. She went to find Nathaniel. He was standing at the edge of the yard facing the open range, and she came and stood beside him, the way she had learned to stand beside him over the course of 2 months, not filling the space with words, just being present in it. "The proposal was real," she said. "I heard it. I think he'll follow through on the bank arrangement." "So do I." She looked at the range. The grass was coming in at the edges where the frost had retreated the first thin green of a Wyoming spring tentative and stubborn in equal measure. "If he follows through," she said carefully, "there's something worth thinking about in the consulting arrangement. Not for him, for the other properties. For the people on those ranches who are in the same position we were in November." She paused. "If someone had come to those ranches with what I know the way I came here—" "You want to help them," Nathaniel said. "I want the knowledge to go somewhere useful," she said. "It's what my father always said. Knowledge was meant to be shared. Keeping it locked up doesn't honor the person who taught it to you." He was quiet for a moment. "Then we'll think about it," he said. "Together." Together. She let the word sit in her chest for a moment. It was a small word. She had been traveling a very long distance toward it for a very long time. The wedding happened in April. It was not a large ceremony. The territory did not offer many options for large ceremonies, and neither of them wanted one. What they wanted was the specific simplicity of a thing that was real, witnessed by people who had earned the right to be there. The 22 ranch hands were there. All of them. Tommy stood up front with the expression of a young man who was trying very hard not to show how much the occasion was affecting him, and who was failing in the best possible way. Cole Dawson stood in the back and cleaned something off his boot during the ceremony, and absolutely did not wipe his eyes, and nobody said anything about it. Martinez had brought flowers from somewhere. Real ones, early spring wildflowers from the eastern pasture, tied with a piece of leather cord. He handed them to Eleanor before the ceremony without a word, and she had looked at them for a moment, and then at him, and he had nodded once with the same expression he'd had the morning he got the furnace door open, profound personal satisfaction at a thing properly done. The preacher asked if anyone had objections. Cole Dawson made a sound that might have been a cough. No one objected. Nathaniel looked at her during the ceremony. The way he had looked at her across the kitchen table in the middle of the night when they were going over numbers together, like she was a thing that made sense to him, a thing that fit into the understanding he had of the world. Not like she was performing some version of herself that the moment required. Like she was exactly who she was, and that was the person he was looking at. She had spent so many years being looked at by people who were looking for the version of her they wished existed instead. She had forgotten that this other kind of looking was possible. She remembered it now. The summer that followed was the best season Black Creek Ranch had seen in years. The cattle recovered. The breeding stock produced well. The smokehouse ran at full capacity, and then beyond it as Cole built 2 additional rack sets, and Martinez reinforced the eastern section into a second working chamber, effectively doubling the operation. The weekly delivery to Harrow Creek had expanded to a bi-weekly delivery. 3 other camps were receiving monthly shipments. Victor Hale's bank arrangement came through in May. The note was renegotiated at terms that gave the ranch enough breathing room to invest in the expansion without straining the operating budget. Hale himself appeared twice more at the ranch, both times on business related to the consulting arrangement. And both times he was civil and direct, and treated Eleanor as the professional she was. She neither liked him nor trusted him entirely, but she worked with him with the clear-eyed practicality of someone who had learned to distinguish between the people she chose to keep close and the people she simply needed to deal with effectively. Those were 2 different categories. The first property she visited as a consultant was a ranch 40 miles south called the Meridian, owned by a woman named Ruth Casper, who had been running it alone since her husband died the previous fall. She was 53, dry-voiced, hard-worked, and suspicious of Eleanor's arrival in the way of someone who had been offered help before and found strings attached to every offer. Eleanor spent 2 days at the Meridian and did not try to fix anything and did not offer advice and did not present a plan. She simply worked alongside Ruth Casper and answered the questions she was asked and let the situation show itself. On the evening of the second day, Ruth looked at her across the table and said, "Hale sent you." "Hale arranged for me to come," Eleanor said. "That's not the same thing." Ruth looked at her. "What's the difference?" she said. "The difference is that what I know belongs to me," Eleanor said. "Not to him. He can arrange the introduction. He doesn't get to dictate what I share or who benefits from it." She paused. "You have a smokehouse structure on this property that has been sitting empty for 3 years. I can tell you exactly what it would take to get it running. What you do with that information is your decision entirely." Ruth Casper was quiet for a long time. 3 years, she said at last. "I know. My husband always said he was going to fix it up." She looked at her hands on the table. "He ran out of time." "People do," Eleanor said. "That doesn't mean the building ran out of time." Ruth looked at her. "Show me," she said. Eleanor showed her. She did not do it for her. She showed her, walked her through every step, explained the reasoning behind every decision, and then stood back and let Ruth Casper make each choice herself. It was slower that way. It required more patience. But she had learned from her father that knowledge handed to someone was a gift that lasted a season. Knowledge earned alongside someone was a gift that lasted a lifetime. When she left the Meridian 2 weeks later, the smokehouse had its first fire in 3 years. Ruth walked her to her horse. "I have a friend," Ruth said. "Over near Laramie. Her situation is similar to mine was." She paused. "Would you send me her name?" Eleanor said. "And where to find her?" She rode back to Black Creek Ranch in the long light of a Wyoming afternoon. She thought about her father. She thought about his hands and his record book and the way he had taught her, not by doing it for her, but by standing beside her while she did it, by trusting her with the real knowledge, and not a simplified version of it, by treating what she could do as worth teaching, even when the world outside his smokehouse had told him there was no reason to bother. She had spent a long time wondering what she owed him for that. She thought she was starting to understand. September brought the first community gathering Black Creek Ranch had hosted in years. It had been Tommy's idea. Originally, he had said, with the directness he had been developing all summer, that if people in the territory were going to know what the ranch had done, they should know it from the ranch itself and not from rumor, and that the best way to make that happen was to invite them and feed them. Nathaniel had looked at Eleanor when Tommy said it, and Eleanor had looked at Tommy, and then she had said, "He's right." And that had been the end of the discussion. They fed 40 people. They fed them from the smokehouse. Eleanor cooked alongside Martinez and Tommy and 2 women from neighboring ranches who had asked if they could come early and help. And what happened in that kitchen? The morning of the gathering was something she had not planned for and could not have the specific joy of people cooking together, talking together, sharing the work and the knowledge and the particular warmth that comes from feeding people well. She had been so focused on the professional value of what she knew that she had briefly lost sight of this part of it, the joy of it, the pure, uncomplicated pleasure of a table full of people eating something that someone had built with care. Her father had never lost sight of it. She reminded herself not to again. Nathaniel stood beside her during the gathering, which was what he did. Now stood beside her, moved with her, was present in the same space she was in, because that was where he wanted to be, and he had stopped apologizing for wanting things. He had told her once in the quiet of the kitchen late at night that for the 3 years after Margaret died, he had felt like someone who had been handed a life that didn't quite fit anymore and couldn't figure out how to alter it. He had told her that was over. She believed him, because she knew what it looked like when something didn't fit, and she knew what it looked like when it did, and what she saw in his face these days was the second thing. Cole Dawson had received a letter from Clara in August. He told Eleanor about it on a Tuesday morning while she was doing inventory coming into the smokehouse with his hat in his hand, and the specific dignity of a man who had decided to say something and was going to say it right. Clara was doing well. She had written back, after receiving his letter, and then he had written again, and she had written again, and they were writing now with the careful rebuilding frequency of two people who had hurt each other and missed each other and were trying to find the road back with the honesty that the distance required. She might come visit, he said. In the spring. She should, Eleanor said. She'd be welcome here. He looked at her. I know she would, he said. That's the only reason I mentioned it. He put his hat back on and went. She stood in the smokehouse for a moment after he left and thought about Clara Dawson in Colorado, working in a bakery, having found somewhere good, and people who saw her right. She thought about the chain of it, how Clara had left at 17, and Cole had carried that absence for years, and the fire of it had come out wrong in the early days at Black Creek, and had eventually slowly been redirected into something that could build instead of burn. She thought about how nothing was wasted, really. Not if you paid enough attention. Not if you were willing to do the work of understanding what something could become rather than just looking at what it was. Winter came early that year. The first snow fell in October, and it fell hard and stayed, and the territory hunkered down into the long cold season that it did every year, with the patient implacable permanence of something that had no interest in your preferences. Black Creek Ranch did not hunker. The smokehouse ran hot through October and November, and into December, producing the batches moving through in steady rhythm. The deliveries going out on schedule, the ledgers climbing in the direction that made Nathaniel's face do the quiet, disbelieving thing she had come to love, the thing where he would look at a number and then look at her, and seem to be reconciling two versions of the world. The version where the ranch failed, and the one where it didn't. Tommy turned 17 in November. Eleanor made him a cake, which was not a practical thing to do, given that she had a full production schedule and the kitchen was already running at capacity, and which she did anyway because Tommy Briggs had slept in a barn when she arrived and had learned every aspect of the smokehouse operation and had become, over the course of a year, not only indispensable to the business, but indispensable to her in the specific way of people who came into your life at a moment when you most needed to see what you could become, and showed you that it was worth the effort. She put the cake in front of him at the supper table. He looked at it. Then he looked at her. "Thank you," he said, very quietly. "Happy birthday, Tommy," she said. He looked at the cake for a moment. Then, "I used to think this place was going to close," he said, "before you came. I used to lie in the barn and think about where I'd go if it did." "Where would you have gone?" she asked. He shrugged the one shoulder shrug that meant there was a real answer he wasn't giving. "Somewhere," he said. "I don't know where. I just knew I didn't want to leave." He looked up. "I don't think about it anymore. Where I'd go." She nodded. "Good," she said. Cole cut the first piece of cake with the efficiency of a man who had been waiting for the discussion to end so the eating could begin, and the supper table went back to the comfortable noise of 22 people who had stopped just surviving together and were now simply living. A year after Eleanor Whitmore stepped off that wagon, she sat at the kitchen table at Black Creek Ranch on a February evening with her father's record book open in front of her. She was adding to it. She had been adding to it for months. Her own notes alongside his, her observations from the Meridian, and the other properties she had visited, the specific knowledge she had developed in this particular landscape, at this particular altitude, with these particular conditions. The book was almost full now, her handwriting filling the margins of his, and she had started a second book that lived beside it on the shelf. Nathaniel came in and sat across from her. He looked at the record books. "What are you writing?" he said. "Everything," she said. He leaned forward slightly to look at the page. She turned it so he could see not the formulas and the temperatures, but the section she had started at the back of the book, the part that was not about the smokehouse at all. The part that was about the people. Tommy and his questions. Cole and his hammer and his letter from Clara. Martinez and his Spanish vocabulary and his expression of professional satisfaction. The hunters she had sent out with a plan, and who had come back understanding something different about what their work meant to the whole. Ruth Casper and the Smokehouse fire that had burned for the first time in 3 years. Nathaniel read in silence. When he looked up, his face was doing the thing she loved. "You're writing it down so it doesn't get lost," he said. "My father always said that the biggest mistake people made was thinking that what they knew would survive them without effort." She looked at the book. "It doesn't. Knowledge dies with people all the time. Things that could have saved someone get buried with the person who held them." She closed the book carefully. "I'm not going to let that happen to this." He looked at her across the table. "Eleanor," he said. She looked up. "The advertisement I placed," he said. "The one you answered. I went back and read it recently. It said, 'Must cook for large crew and hard work required.'" He paused. "I did not know when I wrote that what I was actually asking for. I did not know that what I needed was someone who would rebuild a ruin and feed 22 men through the hardest winter in recent memory and face down a man who was trying to steal everything I had and write down every piece of knowledge she possessed so that it would outlast both of us." He reached across the table. "I asked for a cook." "I know," she said. "I got something I don't have words for." She put her hand in his. "You got a partner," she said. He held her hand. "Yes," he said. "I did." Outside, the Wyoming winter pressed against the walls of Black Creek Ranch the way it always had and always would. Vast, indifferent, making no exceptions, moving through the territory with the cold authority of something that had been here long before any of them and would be here long after. It did not care about Smokehouse records or banknotes or the specific stubborn happiness of two people sitting at a kitchen table with their hands clasped between two worn record books. But inside those walls, the stove was warm and the lamp was lit, and 22 men were alive and fed and forward-looking in the bunkhouse, and a 16-year-old boy who no longer counted exits had fallen asleep at his desk over a ledger book he was too dedicated to put down. And Eleanor Whitmore. Eleanor Carter, now. Eleanor Carter of Black Creek Ranch, Wyoming Territory, who had arrived with a trunk and a dead man's record book, and the absolute refusal to be less than she was, looked at the man across the table and felt the full, solid, unambiguous weight of a life that had finally stopped apologizing for itself. She had come a very long distance to this table. She had carried a very great deal on the way, and she had set none of it down. Not the knowledge, not the grief, not the years of being underestimated, not her father's voice in her ear telling her that broken was not the same as finished. She had carried all of it here, and here it had become something. It had become everything. The woman who arrived at a dying ranch in February left no part of herself behind when she rebuilt it. She brought everything. She was the weight of her, the knowledge of her, the stubborn, undiminishing wholeness of her, and she laid it down, not as a sacrifice, but as a foundation. And on that foundation, something stood. Something that would stand long after the winter, long after the records, long after the last fire in the smokehouse had gone cold. The truth that Eleanor Whitmore had carried her whole life and proven finally beyond any argument. That the person everyone overlooks is very often the one holding everything together. And that a woman who knows her own worth does not need the world's permission to build something permanent. She never did. She never would.